Welcome back, everybody. Thank you very much for getting seated so promptly. You're now about to experience, I think, one of the highlights of this great day of talks, because we have the pleasure of the company of two absolute thought leaders on all of this stuff with us today. And the subject of our discussion right now is both timely but also strangely retro. Tariffs used to be a thing of the past. They're really the trade policy equivalent of, shoulder pads and knitted ties and flares, relics from a previous era. And yet, tariffs are back in fashion. You could think about them as the little black dress of trade, apparently the perfect choice for any occasion, endlessly reinterpreted, but usually pretty uncomfortable. I think I speak for us all when we really just want to get back into our WTO pyjamas and curl up on the sofa. So this conversation couldn't be more timely. We're in a landscape where we see many of our old favourites, mercantilism, might makes right, spiralling protectionism, but also a strange new world, a world of napkin deals, one-way reciprocal tariffs and economic security. So what are we going to talk about in this panel? Well, of course, this whole day is about future-proofing trade strategies. So let's start with a few data points about the strategies. Global trade is forecast to grow by 0.5% next year. The amount of trade covered by tariffs is up 400% over the past year. That's the biggest increase in the history of the WTO. The amount of trade covered by tariffs is up to $2.6 trillion US. Trade policy uncertainty is at an all-time high. The basic building blocks of predictability, progressive market opening and non-discrimination that have really ruled the roost since 1947 seem to be disappearing. We're moving from an era of rules to deals. It's no exaggeration to say that US trade policy could have changed by the time I finish these opening remarks. To unpack the tariffs and what comes next for global trade, we're very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Deborah Elms and Professor Peter Draper. Now, for those of you who were at ATEPS last year, you will of course be very familiar with Debbie. She's widely regarded as the go-to for all matters trade in Asia and beyond, formerly at the Asian Trade Centre, which she founded, so she's a fantastic entrepreneur as well as policy expert, and now serves as Head of Trade Policy at the Hinrich Foundation in Singapore. She pops up just about every day in media articles, webinars and conferences with her trademark incisive analysis and witty commentary. Professor Peter Draper is the Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade and Director of the Jean Monnet Centre on Trade and Environment at the University of Adelaide. Now, Peter similarly has decades of experience in trade policy, negotiations and education, and has affiliations with a raft of institutions, including the Australian Services Roundtable, International Chamber of Commerce and think tanks in Europe, Australia and elsewhere. Now, Debbie and Peter are not just here because of their impressive CVs, but they're also perfectly placed for this conversation because they come from two economies very similar to New Zealand in the sense that they survive and thrive by looking outward, and they're trade policy innovators. So I'm shortly going to invite Deborah and Peter to share some opening remarks. We're then going to take a deeper dive into some of the key elements of this current trade landscape through questions that I'm going to ask them. But most importantly, we're going to have time for plenty of questions from you at the end. So as Debbie and Peter talk, please jot those down. We would in particular love to hear from the students in the room. We very much welcome bringing the next generation into this wonderful world of trade policy. And also from our colleagues from ASEAN, it's wonderful to have you here. And so please do feel free to ask questions. We would love to hear from you as well. So without further ado, let me start off by asking Peter to make his opening remarks and then Debbie. So over to you, Peter, thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Stephanie, for that generous introduction, and many thanks to Jen and the team for the invitation to be with you today. I thought I'd start by briefly recapping, let's just say, President Trump's trade policy moorings. And I'll start with a caveat, which is that analysis, which is what I'm going to provide does not necessarily imply endorsement. So I'm trying to, like the rest of us, make sense of what the US is up to. And because I operate in an academic frame, I'm trying to put it in an analytical context. So I'm going to start with something called optimum tariff theory, which you may or may not have heard of. It actually has quite a long lineage in economics. It goes back to the 19th century. I won't go through all the leading thinkers, free trade thinkers, many of them associated with optimum tariff theory. But the basic idea is that if you are a large market, and particularly the largest market in the world, the United States, largest consumer market, you can set, in theory, your tariff level at an optimal level, whereby, as President Trump likes to say, and the media regularly dismisses him, the foreigners pay the tariff. And essentially the theory is you change the terms of trade, you force the foreigners to eat the tariff, you protect your domestic industry, they grow as a result, and then companies outside the tariff area that still want to operate in the United States market will jump over the tariff, so they'll engage in tariff hopping behavior, and invest in the United States. And so when President Trump talks about tariffs, he also talks about investment. Now, the third pillar of this is tariff revenues. And that's certainly been a strong emphasis of the Trump administration. And you would have to say objectively, they have raised a lot of revenues through the tariffs. Now, that'll have, I think, a relatively marginal impact on their huge fiscal deficit, but it is having some impact. I sense markets are starting to take that into account. So that's a charitable interpretation. Let's leave aside the implementation of this theory. That's another matter entirely. I'm sure Debbie will have a lot to say about that. There's also, one should mention, a national security framing to this. And if you read, and I've stopped reading them, to be honest, but the presidential executive orders, they always start with this national security framing. We have to rebuild manufacturing to compete with China, particularly. China is the pacing threat, etc. So you put all that together, and again, charitable interpretation. There is a system of logic at work, but the application obviously has been, and will continue to be, I think, hugely problematic, generating all that uncertainty. And then finally, of course, there's the underlying question, will the reciprocal tariff regime hold? Because the Supreme Court will rule on this very soon and may well, if I read the tea leaves correctly, overturn it. Now, of course, they're working on plan B, C, D, and E, and I'm sure Debbie will know what those are, but we will see whether it holds or not. Now, the external expression of this is what we know as the reciprocal tariffs regime. Let's just call it that. And obviously, it's very focused on correcting, pull air quotes, goods trade deficits with the United States, or rather that the United States has with trading partners. The flip side is promoting US exports into trading partners, particularly agricultural exports, LNG, etc. And we've seen various deals around that, and eliminating trading partners' non-tariff barriers. Now, whether that's on an MFN basis for all trading partners or just for US companies, we'll wait to see in terms of the details of these various deals. I think another very important component is expunging Chinese content from exports to the United States. And by Chinese content, I mean the imported content of, say, an export from Cambodia to the United States. Hence, there are dual tariffs in place. We're not quite sure what the rules of origin will look like. And there's also an ownership dimension to this. So if there's a Chinese-owned company that is invested in Cambodia and is exporting to the United States, that would be inhibited as well. So very clearly targeted at China. And there's a long lineage, obviously, to that particular policy position. It's not just the Trump administration that has had concerns with the bilateral trade deficit with China. A final thing, and it's important in the Australian context going forward, I would argue, is the focus on US digital services, exports, and investments in key trading partners. So the Europeans are in the frame at the moment, but Australia has a social media ban for 16-year-olds and younger. There's a very strong political consensus on the need for this ban. It's just come into force. That could be seen as a non-tariff barrier. So if the United States wants to mobilize that as a trade issue, they may choose to do so in the future, and we'll see what happens. And then turning to our region, what are some of the regional manifestations of all of this? So firstly, Australia, I'll start there. We have traditionally a trade deficit with the United States. They have a surplus with us. Hence, we got the lowest reciprocal tariff number, which was 10%. But of course, we know we have a free trade agreement with the United States that's effectively been torn up and thrown in the bin. So that's not very useful. We also have relatively minimal exports compared to New Zealand, certainly, and others in the region, to the United States. So less than 5% of our total exports go to the US. That's concentrated on beef, and there are particular issues in the beef trade, as we know. So actually, Australian beef exporters are doing pretty well right now, exporting into the US beef market. Largely or substantially because Brazilian beef exporters were hit with a 50% duty that had nothing to do with the trade deficit or anything else, but purely to do with politics. So this gets back to the rather mercurial nature of the implementation of reciprocal tariffs. Then in terms of New Zealand, my understanding is you're relatively more exposed. I read this morning 13 to 15% of your exports go to the US, mostly concentrated in agricultural commodities. You've just got the reprieve on beef, that's great. But I'm not sure about the others. But your degree of exposure is higher, and your trade surplus with the US was small, I think, last year, but you had a surplus last year, and that's when it counted, was in the year 2024. Hence, you got the higher 15% duty, which is entirely arbitrary. So I can't apologize, but sympathies to New Zealand. If I then turn to our Southeast Asian, because we've got Southeast Asian colleagues in the room, but also our Northeast Asian colleagues in the region, they are obviously much more exposed to the US market. And there's a systemic issue here. So these countries, by and large, have developed on the basis of an export-oriented industrialization strategy. And more recently, that's been based on importing parts and components from China and exporting to the United States and to some extent to the European Union, depending on the country in question. That model, I think, is very much in the frame. So what is the future of that model in a reciprocal tariffs context where imported Chinese content is going to be effectively prohibited from entering the United States market? Well, what it means from an ASEAN point of view, I guess, is you have to double down on regional integration. And what all of us are doing, which is focusing on diversification. Now, in the Australian case, I think it looks quite similar to New Zealand's strategy, which is we are redoubling our ASEAN focus. So ASEAN is a key regional market for us. Similarly, Japan and Korea. China is our biggest export market. That's been problematic recently. And in effect, we are caught between, I would say, two coercive superpowers. So the United States reciprocal tariff regime is fundamentally coercive, as Stephanie prefaced. It's give me something, you give it to me, give me something more, you give it to me, and then give me something more. So the Financial Times journalists framed this as dealing with the Vikings back in the pre-Middle Age Europe, where the Viking would arrive at your doorstep, make demands of tributes. You would hand over what they asked for, and then they would come back next year and demand more. That is effectively the US reciprocal tariff negotiation strategy. Now, in that context, my view is don't give them anything to start off with, because that's just going to get them started. Now, Europe had to do that for the reasons set out in the previous panel. I understand those motivations. Similarly, the UK. So it's tough what to do. Your degree of exposure is much higher than ours. We're relatively lucky. But I would say in the Australian case, in the build-up to our Prime Minister's visit to Washington just a couple of months ago, really, actually last month, I think we're being recorded, but I'll say this anyway. So I will liken this to a metaphor, which is a Lord of the Rings metaphor. If you think of Sauron's eye sweeping across Middle-earth, Australia was ducking low, we were Frodo. We did not want to be noticed. And that, I think, was the essence of the Albanese government strategy. Just lie low, bide your time. When the time came, look to make the best of a bad situation and hope it does not blow up in the Oval Office. And in the end, they played it reasonably well, I think, and we got the critical minerals deal. By the way, we're behind this. They were reviewing the AUKUS submarine deal. So if I think about what happened to Europe, why did Europe effectively kowtow? Because that's what Europe did, in my view. It's because of Ukraine and President Trump's Ukraine posture at the time. And that's still a little bit unpredictable, I think. But in our case, we were terrified that they would withdraw support for the AUKUS deal. So we didn't want that to be an issue. But in the end, they finalized the review just before Prime Minister Albanese went to Washington, and things went pretty well, partly as a result. So complicated, lots going on, plenty to discuss.
Thanks, Peter. And I think New Zealand had a touch of the Frodo trade strategy as well, but I must say it's not as impressive as your golf strategy from Trump 1.0. But anyway, Debbie, over to you.
Yeah. Well, what a year we've had. Yeah? How many of you were at ATEPS last year? Okay, so some of you. Hopefully I don't repeat myself too much. Let me just give you an analogy that I've been using that I think works well to explain why we are all so, first of all, packing rooms whenever the word tariff comes up. I mean, I could talk about tariffs every day and have 150 people rock up to listen to a speech about tariffs. Like, that's just crazy, right? That is nuts. Why? Because suddenly everybody is interested in it, including, Uber drivers and, my children who finally kind of get what I do now, which is great. Why? Well, I would argue part of the problem is that we've had 80 years, so the entire working career of everyone in this room has been spent painstakingly building up this beautiful ceramic vessel that held the multilateral trading system, the rules, the procedures, the norms of behavior. We just kept making it sort of bigger. We added all sorts of doodads. We painted it. We put embellishments on it, whatever. It didn't always work well, to be honest. I mean, it was a little ugly by the end, a little top-heavy in some areas. And it kept getting kind of shoved closer to the edge of the table for a variety of reasons. But it still sat there, and we still paid allegiance to this vase until this last year. And I would point specifically to April 2nd, is the date on which the vase was pushed onto the floor and shattered into pieces. Thank you, Donald Trump. So then, the reason why I think we are all feeling personally and professionally unsettled, whether you are in government or business or academia, is because that's 80 years worth of effort. It's 80 years worth of inputs. It's 80 years worth of ways of operating that is now in pieces on the floor. And that is unsettling. It really is. It's professionally, personally unsettling, and the hits don't stop coming. So we keep throwing more and more pottery onto the ground. Now, before everyone totally panics, let me just say, this is not to say that we're not going to continue to trade. It's not to say that the global rules-based system is never going to work again, that we are never going to engage in interactions. It's to say that the method that we are going to use going forward is going to be different. So what we were doing is not what we are doing and is not what we will be doing. So we are now in the process of looking at these shards of pottery and trying to figure out, well, what do you build with them? We've got, again, decades of interaction, some places more than others, and one of the reasons why I am still in Asia after 21 years is that this is a region that understands the importance of connection, and it understands that you cannot grow and thrive, you're not going to make jobs, you're not going to have gainful employment for students if you don't reach out to the broader community, that you can't be inward looking only because that doesn't lead to growth. So this is a region that has lots of track record, lots of experience with integration, is lots of pieces of pottery that can be put together relatively quickly, relatively easily to make different kinds of vessels. Now we're in this really difficult position now of the rebuild of whatever we're going to have. This is not going to be fast, and it's not going to be easy, and we're not rebuilding the vase as it was. So the question is, what are we going to build? And I don't think we know yet. Are we going to build like one very shallow platter in which we have a certain set of rules that we might all agree on, but it's very thin? Are we going to build multiple vases? Are we going to build little thin ones in which there's only a few members or two? Are we going to build like some big pieces of pottery and some smaller ones? It's totally unclear. So on the bright side, for those of you who are especially younger in the room, you know, we have a whole lifetime of building up whatever this thing is going to look like. And I think in some ways that's very liberating, right? Because if I had done that, well, when we did this last year, and certainly the year before, you know, the kinds of activities that you could be engaged in were, of course, we all thought fascinating. We've been in trade forever. But no one else found it, or not that many other people found it that fascinating, you know. So, and your scope for thinking creatively was really, in a way, limited because we just sort of had an operating system, and you kind of moved forward, and you looked for example, you could do a free trade agreement, but you just looked for a new partner, and you replicated what you did last time in a new setting, a few tweaks along the edges. That's what we did going forward. Those days are also changing. And so, again, as a positive, being in Asia, everybody always wants the upside. Nobody wants to hear about bad news. So here's the upside. The upside is pottery broken, opportunity to rebuild. What are we going to make it look like? How are we going to build on some of the existing rules, because we don't want to throw them all out? How are we going to integrate in ways that are better fit for purpose? How can we pick up and take forward some initiatives that were super important, that never got maybe as much attention and focus as they should have had, like services, for example. Like, we've spent an entire year dealing with trade in goods, and we will probably spend more time talking trade in goods. And of course, I think goods are important, just to be clear. But they're not the only end of the story. And so it's nice that we now have an opportunity, in a way, to talk about, well, what does it mean to trade in services? What does it mean to trade in digital services? How are we going to deal with digital rules? How are we going to deal with the equity, inclusion, et cetera, agenda that we had going forward that was a little bit stuck because we were trying to add it to this vase that was complicated. So we have a lot of new ways in which to get organized, which, again, I think is fantastic. Now, we're doing that at a time of continued turbulence. So as much as I would love to say Trump smashed the vase and then walked out of the room, no, the man has smashed the vase and keeps throwing stuff at it. And so that is a continuing challenge for all of us. And since we're supposed to talk about Trump for a bit more, let me spend just another 2 or 3 minutes on Trump, and then I'm happy to take questions. I love how you think that there's a strategy behind what Trump is up to. You were being charitable. You were being like extra charitable and extremely polite. You know, there's no real strategy. It's really that he has very few fixed beliefs. The two beliefs that he's had that have been consistent across his entire lifetime is that the world is out to screw the United States, and tariffs fix everything. So those are the two fixed beliefs that he has. Everything else is sort of fungible and changeable, depends on who he talked to last, et cetera. But those two things he believes to his core. And he has surrounded himself with a very small team, and I cannot emphasize enough how small this team is. We're looking at less than 5 people that matter in the White House. Now, those of you in MFAT and those of you who are in trade ministries in your own countries, you know that that's crazy. Nobody makes trade policy with 5 people, in fact, only one decision maker. Like, that just doesn't happen in your own economies, but that is what is happening in the US. So you can have conversations with people who say, oh, well, I talked to the Southeast Asia desk at USTR and they said blah, blah, whatever they happen to say. Okay, great. But do that, just to be clear, do that. But the reality is it's irrelevant, because whatever the Southeast Asia desk at USTR came up with may or may not be the thing that's on the desk in the Oval Office at the end of the day. And even if the Southeast Asia desk at USTR thinks it's fantastic, and maybe there's the last 5 people at the State Department agree with you, and maybe folks maybe in the Defense Department that spoke about it have a view on it, it hits Donald Trump's office and he goes, I don't like it, and then that's the end of it. This is a really, really, and I can't stress this enough, weird, unusual set of policy making out of the US, which you have to try to deal with. Those 2 fixed beliefs, world screwing the US, tariffs are the solution. And whenever he gets himself into a corner, which is happening often and likely to happen more and more often, he will return, I think, to those 2 things, which means that this tariff disruption is not over. It will continue. It will continue in new ways, in different ways, no matter what happens. So let me just make 2 more remarks on this tariff issue with Trump, and then I'll pivot quickly to talk about some interesting things happening outside of the US. Trump is, because he's so obsessed with tariffs, because we have this IEEPA court case coming down the pike very quickly, it is likely, more likely than not, that at least some of the IEEPA tariffs, reciprocal tariffs, will be struck down. So then we're going to have a whole new, what are we going to do about that? Do we refund, to whom, how much, with interest, how quickly? I mean, that's just going to be an unholy mess. But we also have the quick pivot to alternative ways of imposing tariffs. And there are some people keep talking about these much more obscure policies, Section 122 and Section 338, neither one of which has been used for this purpose before. I don't think those are on the table. So just my own view, those are not where we're going to go. Where are we going to go? More 232s on national security grounds. We will continue to have more and more national security coverage, sector by sector, with a very long list of derivatives. And to see, and I'm sure New Zealand is aware of this, but the derivatives list is nuts. On lumber, softwood lumber, we've added kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, and sofas. How your sofa is a national security problem, I have no idea. The Pentagon has never actually been able to explain why there is a national security crisis in your sofa. But whatever. Okay, so that's how we're going to go. More and more national security Section 232s. Those are a problem because they can't be overturned. Once you've declared it a national security problem, it is really difficult, either domestically or internationally, to fix that. So we're going to see more and more 232s. We haven't yet seen them in some of the areas that matter, particularly for New Zealand, on agricultural products, but there's no reason in principle why you couldn't argue that cheese is an equally big national security crisis, that if the soldiers don't eat cheese, they can't fight, or I don't know what. So expect those to continue. And the second approach that I think they're going to roll out very quickly, which probably will not hit New Zealand, although it's unclear, is the use of Section 301. Now, Section 301 is a very alarming instrument, which I personally find fascinating because my PhD dissertation was on Section 301. And when I did this, I chose it deliberately because the United States said it was never going to use 301 again. And I thought, well, that's a great dissertation topic, right? Because now I have a data set that's not going to change. I don't have to constantly update what I'm talking about. I can just look at Section 301 and its use, and that will be great. And I had no idea that it would be coming back again in the first Trump administration and then potentially rolled out more in the second Trump administration, but it's ahead of us. Section 301 is rather than by sector, it's by country. Unfair trade practices. It gives the U.S. executive enormous leverage to do whatever the hell he wants, whenever he wants, against an individual country. So the idea, I think, is going to be, if IEEPA gets struck down, to roll out Section 301s against somewhere between the top 20 and 25 bad trade partners, bad meaning you have a trade deficit in goods, which is the only thing Trump cares about, and then go after you for Section 301. That is also going to be a problem because it's really hard to overturn a Section 301 case. So this is deeply alarming if you are, let's say, a Vietnam with a pretty high bilateral trade balance. and a yet unfinished framework agreement. Now, on the frame, because I know this is going to come up as a question, you're between a rock and a hard place on these framework agreements. Why do them if they could be completely undermined by future actions? But you have to pick the least worst option. And then let me close, because I'm going longer than I meant to. Let me close by saying that while we are so focused on the US, as we should be because they are still the gorilla in the room, there are other problems that we have, but there are also some other solutions. And so let me just highlight this week in particular, which I think is an exciting week, or at least has the potential to be exciting, right? Why is your minister not here? Because he's in India negotiating a free trade agreement. Everyone is stampeding to India to negotiate free trade agreements. They're a pain in the ass. They're going to be very difficult to get a free trade agreement that's meaningful, but they're an important market, and it's important to think about, as the world gets disrupted, how do we better include India into future conversations? How do we make sure that we knit them more closely into whatever is this piece of pottery that we're building? So free trade agreements with India continue. Also, yesterday, although nobody paid attention, but FITP got lost. I think nobody paid attention because the acronym is so awful. So the Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, FITP, just got 2 new members. So now it's 16. I think that's amazing, right? So 16 members, all small economies or smaller economies, trying to figure out what are some rules for the future, what are some projects, some pathfinders, some initiatives that might help small exposed economies thrive in a growing protectionist world. I think that's really something to watch. There's a lot of opportunities there, and I'm delighted that New Zealand, along with Singapore, Switzerland, and the UAE, have been pushing this forward, because I think it's another way to shore up the desire to be integrated in a way that could be, again, quite meaningful, and especially meaningful for businesses. If FITP can pick up practical, implementable projects on a, say, 12 to 18-month basis, wow, could that deliver some real results that matter. And then the last thing is the CPTPP Commission meeting taking place in Melbourne tomorrow and Friday. Now, Steph and I are hoping to be badly disappointed and see an amazing result come out of this meeting in Melbourne. There should be an amazing result, because CPTPP is one of the biggest pieces of pottery that we have left that could form the basis of a really important piece of integration, way to reduce risk, way to increase certainty. But the members, New Zealand is a member, are really struggling to capitalize on the potential benefits of CPTPP. I don't know if they're all in the Frodo crouch and they don't want to capture the eye of Sauron, but they are definitely not embracing CPTPP as much as they should. So we will see what happens. There are at least 3 big things that they need to deal with in Australia, most of which, again, I'm sad to say, I'm going to be disappointed, but they need to deal with the Secretariat. This has been my personal pet peeve since 2009, actually. But if we don't have a secretariat, this is an organization that just can't function. It needs to have a secretariat. We can't have the pieces of pottery built on the backs of what? Somebody who's working on multiple jobs from multiple areas. It doesn't make any sense. We need a secretariat. We need to deal with the accession crisis. We have got a very long queue of very interesting countries that want to join, and if you cannot deal with this in a way that is not bespoke country by country, which is just too resource intensive and takes too long, you're never going to make CPTPP as important as it should be. And then you have to deal as well with how are we going to update the rules? So we have this review, which I like personally because it's the year 3 review. Remember, this agreement came into force in 2018. Those of you who are good at maths may say, wait a second, it's 2025. How can we be having year 3 review in 2025 for an agreement that came into force in 2018? But it shows you the lack of focus that we've had so far on CPTPP. So hopefully that review, which again, I'm prepared to be disappointed, but that review should be ambitious. And it should say, here's a bunch of stuff that's actually super important now. And then I suppose the 4th part, which isn't useful as well, is the collaboration between CPTPP and the EU and ASEAN. And what comes out of that is less ambitious than I had hoped. I really wanted particularly to have the 39 country leaders come together, EU, CPTPP, and then you'd have another well, now 11 with the addition of Timor-Leste to ASEAN. We could have had a really interesting discussion at the leader level. This is why CPTPP matters. We believe in trade. We believe in openness. We will not impose new restrictions on each other. I think that alone would have been incredibly helpful. We're not there yet, but maybe we lay the groundwork for making that happen at the beginning of next year, because this is a really big time of disruption in which we need some bold, ambitious thinking. And so, I mean, I'm delighted to be in New Zealand with people who are thinking bold and are thinking ambitious and are pushing as hard as you can as a small state. I think that is to be applauded. So let me stop there. I went on longer than I meant to. Thanks.
Every word a gem. Thank you, Debbie. And Peter, that is a really fantastic start to this session. And I mean, there's so much to unpack there. So let's get started. Peter, you kicked us off with some economics. So let's start there. So tariffs, leaving aside optimal tariff theory, of course, the whole idea of trade policy and trade should be grounded in comparative advantage, efficiency, all those great motherhood and apple pie concepts. But now tariffs, the most beautiful word in the dictionary, seems to be driven by concerns about fentanyl, Russian oil, keeping President Trump's friends out of prison, reciprocity, industrial policy, investment, coffee prices being too high. I think we can all relate to that one, actually. But above all, these two ideas, which, you know, if we'd been having this conference 5 years ago, probably wouldn't really have featured at all, of national security and economic security. So could we start there? I mean, is this now the driver of trade policy? Is trade still about trade, or is it something else?
Yeah, great question. So I'll draw on President Biden, actually, and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, who framed it as small yard, high fence. Remember that phrase? So the theory being that there's a basket of goods and industries that are deeply connected into national security, and we're worried about them. So that's the small yard. These would be dual-use IT products, for example. So we're going to impose export controls, amongst other things, prevent foreign investment into that sector, maybe prevent our companies from engaging in outward investment into China in these sectors and products. Small yard, high fence that we construct around them. That started under the Biden administration. So President Trump and his tariffs, totally capricious, I completely agree. He didn't start from ground zero. This has been building in the United States for some time. And I suspect, this is an aside, but I suspect that when he moves on, because he will move on, the mold will have been broken in US tariff policy, which is why I started with optimum tariffs as a theoretical construct, because I don't think they're disappearing. We're not snapping back to business as usual. We're going back to something different, and it is going to be high tariffs and a broken rules system. I think, to me, that's very clear. The problem with the small yard, high fence construct is that the yard is getting bigger and the fence is getting higher all the time. So all sorts of things are being thrown into the yard. So now we're talking about critical minerals. And why are we talking about critical minerals? Well, those of us who've been following this for some time know that China dominates processed critical minerals trade. And those are critical, so to speak, for national security and defense industries, amongst other purposes. Also critical for green transition industries. And if we're thinking green transition industries, we have to be thinking energy security. And if we're thinking energy security, we're thinking national security. So I think there's a real trilemma in play here, which is our old trade liberalization objectives that we all agree on, comparative advantage at the center of that. I certainly subscribe to that. By the way, Peter Navarro and Jamison Greer both say explicitly, comparative advantage is dead. Economists got it all wrong. And so now this is the new normal. We'll call it the Turnberry system. And everybody else should just adopt it. And if you read that paper, the Turnberry system, I disagree with every sentence in it. So again, analysis is not the same as agreeing, Debbie. I think we have to analyze what they're saying understand where they're coming from, and think about the longer term implications of this, because I do think the mold has been broken. But the trilemma, just to complete the point, is trade liberalization, if we're thinking about that. You want to increase your trade, you want to export more, you want to import more. Imports are good. And if you want to export, you have to import. So we all know this logic. It's the logic of comparative advantage. But in the process of growing your economy through trade liberalization, the environment moves into the frame. So you have to, in Australia's case, dig more stuff out of the ground to export more. So there's an environmental trade-off. But now we're bringing in the security dimension. So not only are we worried about environment at the same time as growing our economy, but we're also thinking about we don't want to trade with those guys because we're worried about them. So we're restricting our focus. Friendshoring, pick your term, but that's in the mix as well. So we've got a trilemma now in international trade policy, no longer just a trade-off between trade and environment. It's much more complex, I think.
Debbie, anything to add? And I mean, also, another nuance to this, is this just a US phenomenon, or are other people going to start using similar tools?
That's a great question. So far, most of the damage has been limited to the US, which has been great, because we could have had a stampede in the direction of high tariff walls by everyone, a complete collapse of trade, just literally shove all of the pottery pieces into the bin and just be done with it. We have not had that. Yay. However, there are some challenges ahead that I think are going to create additional problems. There are many. Where do you start? I'll just give you a few. One that worries me quite a bit is if you can't sell to the US, you have to sell somewhere. And it's not just, let me just say this crucially, it's not just Chinese firms that are having this realization. If I can't sell to the US, I got to sell somewhere. It's also really good Vietnamese firms. It's really good Cambodian companies who are like, well, if I can't sell to the US, which has been a major partner for us, where am I going to sell? You pivot and you start looking for new markets. The assumption was you would look particularly at the Europeans. Why? Because the Europeans are rich and they buy things similar to what the United States does at similar price points. That hasn't actually happened as much as expected. So the data doesn't show this incredible switch of everybody else going into Europe. Instead, what it shows, among other things, is a lot more trade in Asia, which is good. Spent a lot of time arguing we should have more trade in Asia for Asia. But it's also going to be problematic. And the thing that worries me here is that as you pivot, you're going to start looking for markets that you didn't penetrate before because they were too difficult, they were too small, they were too expensive, whatever. You just didn't do it. Now, faced with not a lot of sales out of the US, you will look for new markets and you will start to pivot into new markets that haven't had that level of competition before. The domestic firms in some of those markets, and I'm looking at some of my ASEAN colleagues, some of the ASEAN members, for example, are about to face an incoming wave of new competitive products. And again, it's not just Chinese. Domestic firms are going to be pushed to the wall because they're not competitive often. What are they going to do? They're going to scream bloody murder to the government to say, do something about this. We're losing our job. We're losing our livelihoods. You have to stop these foreign products from coming into our market. And the risk is that the response will be competitive protectionism. I will raise barriers, whether they're tariffs or other kinds of barriers, to stop foreign firms from flooding into our market. And I think that's what I'm concerned about as we move into 2026 and beyond, is that so far this has been a US phenomenon and everyone has been deer in the headlights trying to figure out how to deal with the United States, as they should for this first year. But as you move into the second year and beyond, then we get the sort of fallout from that. And one of them is we could turn to more protectionism in other locations. And we could do that even, and this is the sort of bummer for people who obviously negotiate trade agreements and care about them, even in the face of trade agreements that say you're not supposed to do that. You know, once the genies are out of the bottle, like national security as an excuse for protectionism, then there's an easy way for a lot of other governments to do the same thing and just say, well, for national security reasons, you know, I hereby protect our local pineapple industry. You know, and I think that is a risk that we run going forward, that this contagion spreads outside of just the US into other places. I hope it doesn't. And I particularly hope it doesn't in Asia, again, because this is an export-oriented region. And if everybody goes protectionist, then we are all going to be much worse off, and the damage will be substantial. So hopefully that does not happen, but I do think the pressures are mounting, and we will see protectionism pop up in new ways going forward.
Guys, remember we talked about this, nothing too negative. We don't want to depress everybody. So, I mean, yeah, fully agree with what you've both said there. Let me ask you another sort of related question, which I guess is more structural or architectural. So one of the interesting features in the Malaysia-US deal that really surfaced something that we've seen whispers of before is this idea of essentially needing to hew to the US line on national security. You know, if you're not our friend, you're our enemy. We expect you, Malaysia, to fully embrace our perspective on national security, including as it's expressed through trade policy. So what do you think will be the impact of that? I mean, it was interesting that Malaysia is one of those economies that's just joined FITP, fantastic news. Of course, there's the Digital Economy Framework Agreement that Malaysia has also substantially concluded along with the rest of ASEAN. One of the specific things that Malaysia is not meant to do is sign on to new digital rules without checking in with the US first. So, I mean, to what extent do you think this sort of US pick-a-lane trade policy is going to have an impact in the region?
Well, that's the gamble for governments, right? So how closely do we align with the US? And you'll note that the Malaysian deal was fascinating. There's another interesting one with Cambodia. Those are both past the framework stage, but they're not, I mean, those people in the room who've actually negotiated trade agreements, you know, you look at these like 15 pages of text and you say, this is not let's not call it a trade agreement. This is like a framework, I don't know what this is, 15 pages. This is not 600 pages of legally binding rules with thousands of pages of schedules. This is like 15-page document of what we would like to see. Well, how do you get out of this? Well, one way that you sort of get out of this is that you say it comes into force when we agree that we have completed all of the domestic procedures we need to do to bring it into force, and then 60 days after that it comes into force. In other words, if I'm supposed to, as the Malaysians are, supposed to mirror US policies on export controls, for example, I'm not a Malaysian domestic politics expert, but my sense is that that is not going to be fast, right? Even if the Malaysian government woke up today and said, oh my God, we absolutely need to follow the US policy because it's the right, sensible one for us. Let's mirror US domestic policies on how we deal with export controls. That is not how the government of Malaysia is structured. That is not how the legal system is structured. That is not how the regulatory system is structured. It will take a fair amount of time to make that actually happen. So between now and then, we can talk about how Malaysia is required to follow the US, but it's not legally binding and is not in force, and we still have to wait until you get your domestic procedures in order. So one thing you do here is you make commitments, knowing full well that it will take a certain amount of time to implement them, again, even if you are wildly enthusiastic about this, and you hope that by the time you get closer to that date, it's clearer whether you actually have to line up with the US as intended or you don't. Now that seems to be a risk that some governments are taking, and I can understand full well why. That seems like the least worst option. But it is risky. It's not just risky in this administration, who could at any moment turn to you and say, why haven't you implemented? You agreed to do it, you haven't done it. What the heck is going on? And you'll note that the US and the EU are just this week engaged in yet another round of like, what the heck is going on with our agreement? But also, the future US administrations could do the same thing. Like, hey, you signed this thing, where is it? Whether they negotiate it or not might not be relevant. The fact is it exists. And so there is a risk of getting locked into policies now for short-term, sensible reasons that turn out to handicap long-term objectives, you know, but again, least worst options, maybe that's the best you could do.
So, bringing you in here, Peter, you know, if we had to, I guess, do a sort of a word cloud for the current trade landscape, tariff would definitely be there, but so would diversification, and everybody's, you know, governments, bless them, are all about diversification, and businesses, I guess, are sort of coming to the realisation that the good old days of knowing what was going to happen are perhaps gone forever. We've got this protectionist landscape, we've got all our broken shards of pottery. So what is the strategy for a business? You can't count on the napkin deal being there forever. Maybe the existing FTAs aren't going to stick. Peter, you talked a little bit about, okay, diversification, people have to start looking around at other markets, but we've got potentially protectionist sort of knee-jerk policy responses in those other markets. So given that this is meant to be a conference about how do we future-proof trade strategies for business, what does a business do in this current world?
That's a tough question to answer, but just quickly if I can comment on what Debbie just said, and then I'll formulate some thoughts in parallel. The one thing we haven't really seen yet is China responding to these deals. And I think it's just a matter of time before the Chinese do start to do that and start to pick on Malaysia or Cambodia or whoever. So you implement that, here are the consequences. So I really wouldn't want to be these countries signing up to these agreements, and definitely the Frodo card is the card to play, but you can only play that for so long, as you say. Now, if I were a business faced with all of this, I think it would depend on a whole range of things. So what am I exporting? What is the nature of my business? I think the most valuable people in the trade transaction world at the moment are supply chain managers. I don't know if there's any supply chain managers in the room, but I think if I were choosing my career options now, it would probably be supply chain management, because they have to deal with all of this at the end of the day. I don't advise businesses, so I'm not in the business of giving advice to you, but I would just say there's so much uncertainty out there, and it's probably going to intensify. But that said, I do think the worst of the reciprocal tariffs action is over. I think that wave has crested. The rest is morphing into different forms and responding to what happens from that Supreme Court decision. So you've just got to keep watching this space, talking to your business associations, who are probably better placed to talk to government on a constant basis, and certainly in MFAT, I'm sure. MFAT is following all of this very closely, working with your business groups, working with your export advisory associations. As a smaller size business, I don't have the time to think about all this stuff, right? So you need these kinds of government-aligned structures that have the knowledge and the capacity to analyze this and scan for the future on a more or less constant basis, I think.
Debbie, I mean, if we look at it at the economy or country level, who are the elves in this picture? Or in the case of New Zealand, maybe Gimli the dwarf. What are the sort of strategic plays that small states or, middle-sized economies could be making at this point?
Well, I think New Zealand is an exemplar, actually, in that regard. And I just mentioned the 3 things that are happening this week, which is what you have to do if you're small. You have to stay agile, nimble, responsive, resilient, flexible, all the words that a consultant would charge you a lot of money to hear. You have to do all of those things, But what does it mean in practice? I think you double down on partnerships that you have. So you still have to deal with the United States, just to be clear. You can't completely hide under the table forever. There has to be at least some kind of recognition that the United States matters. Highly recommend you come up with whatever gold tchotchke you could come up with that you could deliver that is representative of New Zealand, and give it to Trump at whatever earliest opportunity you have, because that makes a difference. So gold things for sure. Flattery always helps. Golf course is fantastic. Whatever it takes, right? Do it. Because that's worth it. If that solves your problem, at least even temporarily, fantastic. And in the meantime, continue to work with other partners in different ways. And I think emphasizing the flexibility that you have to approach different problems in different venues. So if you can't solve it here, let's look at solving it, whatever the problem is, over here. And working with your businesses, because the businesses are also pivoting, and of course they make the supply chains. Government doesn't make supply chains; it's the businesses that do. So you need to really, and this is a hard one for government because you're so busy as it is. What is it that businesses are doing? like actually asking them, what are you doing? Where are you investing? Where are you shedding jobs? Where are you gaining market share? What are the things on your horizon that you need to know if you're government? Because you could be spending all of your time on, I don't know, developing some new FIT-P trade lane with, I don't know what, Paraguay, and discover that none of your businesses care, right? So you really need to do even more engagement with the business community to find out what is it that they actually are thinking about. What is it that they need from government? And how could you potentially support them in, again, unique and innovative ways? Because we do have this opportunity now to think differently. And especially, I think we're going to see a lot more of the more project-driven approaches, more pathfinders, more whatever we want to call them, than we've seen in the past, because at a time of disruption, this is not necessarily when you want to do 600 pages of legally binding text. You want to say, how do we, in the next, again, 12 to 18 months, solve this particular problem as a demonstration, and then we could just build it out after that. We could then go from 1 sector to 5, and then from 5 to 10, or whatever it is. Like, that's the sort of important micro steps I think that need to be taken now. And I think that's how you better navigate the risk and uncertainty going forward. It's not entirely satisfying, and I personally would not want to be a supply chain manager. Those poor people are dying. The US, I think it's now, I think we're now at 32 different customs changes this year. 32. Normally there's like 4 maximum in a year. We have 32. And just to give you some sense of the complexity, when you used to give customs declarations into the United States, think of it as an Excel spreadsheet. There was like 1 row for the thing that, microphone, 1 row. Then the US said, well, that's not going to do anymore. So they expanded it from 1 row to 8. So now there are lots of because of all of this derivative stuff, especially microphone has steel, it has semiconductors, all sorts of stuff in it, new rows. Then they realized 8 rows wasn't enough either. So now every product has a space for 32 different entries per thing that you're trying to export, whether it's a microphone or a glass or whatever, 32 rows. And you've now changed the rules more than 30 times in this year. Those folks are dying. So I don't know if that's really the space to be in, but maybe, lawyers are doing very well. Some of the consulting companies out of the US are doing extraordinarily well, because we are now also, one thing we haven't mentioned, which maybe I should put on the agenda, we have this bizarre, who would have thought it, but company-specific trade policies getting made. Oh. Now, if you'd asked any of us in this room, I'm guessing, 3 years ago, if there was going to be a company-specific policy ever made, particularly by the US, we all would have said, of course not, that's insane. And yet we're seeing it now. So again, let's hope that stays isolated to the US and doesn't morph into everybody else, because those supply chain managers really will die. If it's not just 32 rows per product, but by company, by country, the complexity is just...
I've got a great idea. Why don't we all come together in Geneva and negotiate a set of global rules? And that does actually bring me to the WTO, which, it pains me as a former New Zealand WTO agriculture negotiator. It's painful to say that we've got through an hour of discussion without really talking about the WTO. But obviously the US has been, if not certainly one of the few animating forces in the WTO, and before that the GATT. I think it would not take much to make a very compelling case for needing a global trade rule book more than we ever have before. Climate change, food security, digital transformation, AI. Where is the WTO in this landscape, if anywhere? And what are you anticipating to come out of MC14? I would like to hear both of your perspectives. Preferably something upbeat, if you don't mind.
So MC14, Ministerial Conference, 14th, scheduled to take place in Cameroon. I doubt it will, just because of Cameroonian domestic political problems that are going largely under the radar at the moment, so likely to take place in Geneva. But we'll see what the venue will be. So the flagship issue on the agenda is reform of the WTO, which means different things to different people. So let's take a couple of headline issues. Special and differential treatment, important for our ASEAN colleagues, I think. Singapore still self-identifies as a developing country in the context of the WTO, which on objective measurement criteria doesn't make any sense, but probably makes political sense to Singapore in the ASEAN context. But the more egregious cases would be countries like India, which has huge industrial capacities, but a lot of poor people, but in its industrial capacities can outcompete Europeans, Australians, the Americans, etc., but will claim special and differential treatment status. So don't ask me to do as much because I'm poor and I'm a developing country. And that's a long-standing principle in the WTO, but many developed countries are concerned about it and want to see it reformed. But that's where the agreement ends. So something needs to be done. Nobody can agree on what that is. And so that's just one key issue, I think, that's bogging down the WTO reform conversation. Let's take another uncontroversial issue, industrial subsidies and China's state capitalist system. The Americans have been arguing for a long time that the WTO was not created to accommodate an economy the size of China that pursues a state capitalist development model with huge amounts of subsidies sloshing around its system. And there's truth to that. I think the Chinese would say, by and large, we observe the rules, we observe the letter, if not the spirit, and you can debate all of that. And probably you do need the WTO and dispute settlement to sort some of this out, but that's been tried pretty unsuccessfully, I think. So what to do about industrial subsidies reform? And that's before you get to things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, bringing the sustainability issues into the conversations. Carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the EU is putting one in place now. It's been pretty controversial in Belém in Brazil, the COP30 negotiations that are underway now. And it's also controversial in the WTO. So how do we deal with these kinds of things in the future? So lots of things that divide the members. The only way to reform the WTO is to achieve consensus. But we can't get to consensus. And we also need consensus to reform the other major issue, which is the consensus principle. Because the problem is you've got countries like the US, like South Africa, like India, that don't shy away from, as WTO negotiators would say, taking hostages. So in the Indian case, they want to protect their particular form of agricultural subsidies, so they take hostages in other areas, like digital commerce taxation, for instance, the e-commerce moratorium. And the US took the entire dispute settlement system hostage when it didn't like what it was seeing. So it's not just India that's doing this. So if you can't get consensus on what needs to be reformed, and you can't get consensus on reforming the consensus principle, the flip side of which is, I think, we need a lot more plurilateral agreements. So here Australia and New Zealand are very much like-minded, together with Singapore and others. But we can't get consensus on that either. So it's very difficult to see how all of that comes together in MC14, wherever it takes place.
Debbie, anything to add on the WTO or other long-standing trade institutions? I mean, APEC being a sort of a signal exemplar in our own region.
Well, I would say, don't give up on the WTO, because, the instinct will be to put your resources in things that seem to be moving and not put resources into things that are stuck. So why should we focus on the WTO? I think that is a battle in every economy at this point. But I think that would be a mistake. You have to continue to prioritize the WTO, because at the end of the day, we do really need to have global rules. Crucially, we need to have global rules for small companies, because small companies, no matter how awesome your trade agreements are at the bilateral or regional level, they are not easy for small companies to use. And so for small companies, for development in general, for countries that are outside of the parts where there are dance partners for trade agreements, They need the WTO to work. And so it is vital to keep focusing on this institution despite all of its many, many, many challenges. So put your most optimistic, stubborn persons into the WTO desk and let them continue to keep fighting this fight, because it is worth having. On the, APEC is another one that's actually always hard. It's always hard to justify APEC, because every year we have an APEC summit, and every year the journalists that go, it's a smaller number every year, but the journalists that go write, nothing happened this year. Or this is the final statement, and here's 2 sentences that were sort of interesting, and then that's sort of it. But actually, the importance of I would argue APEC is more important now than ever, because if the WTO is broken or not functioning as it should, and if we have this sort of breaking up into smaller groupings, there needs to be a place where you can have a conversation about what's happening that isn't tied to a negotiation. And I think APEC is that spot for at least 21 economies, where you can come together and you can say, here's what's happening, or here's what I think is happening, or here's what options on the table. You don't have to agree to any of them, but at least surfacing them, I think, is important. Now, next year is going to be tough in APEC, right, with China as the chair. It's not going to be easy. It's never easy. But I think it's worth keeping good people attached to the APEC desk, because you need to have those conversations. And I would say, in that sort of similar genre, kudos to ASEAN. It's easy, again, to complain about 1,200 meetings a year at ASEAN, because, that sounds insane, 1,200 meetings a year. But when you think about, what do you need at a time of disruption, you actually need to have those personal links to your counterparts, people that you've met 3 or 4 times a year, going back decades potentially. That's super valuable, because it means that you not only are aware of your own position, but you also know pretty intimately the positions of your counterparts, the way they think, the way they approach things, the sort of domestic constraints that they're under. That becomes extraordinarily valuable, I would argue, at a time of disruption. Because you don't have to start from scratch, where you're meeting with partners sometimes for the first time. Again, all hail FITP, but these are 16 economies now that don't normally deal with each other. It will take a certain amount of time for them to build familiarity with, what is it that Paraguay and Malaysia have in common that they want to get out of this organization? That's going to take some time. ASEAN, at least, has decades of that kind of communication happening, which I think is valuable, and it allows you a space, because you know each other and there's a certain amount of trust that's been built up. It allows you to have conversations about, where do we go from here? This is what we're worried about. We're genuinely going to be honest. This is what we're worried about. What are you worried about? And you have that honest, frank conversations now, which is so vital when we don't have other platforms in which to have those kinds of interactions.
Thanks, Debbie, and fully agree with your comments on all of those subjects, but particularly APEC. And of course, we all know the acronym actually stands for a perfect excuse for a conversation, so works there. Now, in a few minutes, or 1 minute, I'm going to invite questions from the floor. I'm sure there will be lots, but anybody who knows me knows that, okay, the world's obsessed with tariffs. I'm obsessed with services and digital trade. So just in a very sort of quick nutshell, where do services and digital land in this tariff-obsessed world?
I think the bright side is that they're not on the agenda at the moment. So because we're mostly driven by Trump, and Trump, which I find so strange, right? This is a services guy. Real estate, golf courses, whatever, the crypto, whatever, this is all services. He doesn't care about services. I can't figure out, if he doesn't see himself as a services guy, I don't know, but he's obsessed with tariffs, which means that the services have largely flown under the radar. And actually, at a time of disruption, hallelujah, let them stay ducked under the covers for as long as possible. But if you're going to change the way in which we interact with one another, then maybe this is the moment in which services actually moves up the agenda. And again, if you're going to be radical about this, could we rethink the way in which we deal with services? And I think, again, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore have been at the forefront of saying the way in which the WTO in particular deals with services makes no sense. let's think about it differently. But there's some, again, a sort of an opportunity here to say, well, we've been using different ways of addressing services. Does that make sense? Are there other things we need to think about? Do we need to think about services that are digitally delivered, or do we just assume all services are digitally delivered? What does that mean? Do we think about how services are embedded in goods production, like what that looks like? I mean, you know, good news for trade people. There is a huge possibility to rethink some of the sort of settled ways of operating that might unleash more trade and services. And as you become a developed economy, you naturally transition over to more trade and services. What does that look like? And then, to use a word that hasn't appeared, thankfully for me, for a whole morning, what happens to services in a world of AI? And what happens to jobs and services? I mean, there's a whole lot of disruption coming in services, regardless of what happens in the rest of the trade world specifically. How are we going to handle that? What are the rules we're going to have? Like, you know, if we think about like the bigger questions, again, there are many things that keep me awake at night, but one of them is this one. What happens to economic development if the path mechanisms that we've been using to get economic development don't work like they used to? What if you can't move from agriculture to manufacturing because there's only a handful of countries that really secure most of the manufacturing supply chains, and a lot of that is automated with few jobs? Then what happens if you go to services but you can't make the jump to services because of AI disrupting services? Where does growth in economic development come from? You know, so there's a good news for students, like a lot of stuff out there and a ton of dissertation topics that you know, could keep you busy for a very long period of time.
Well, and for Jennifer, I'm sure she's taking a note for next year's theme. So Peter, 30 seconds on this topic. I know you're on the board of the Australian Services Roundtable. Any insights to share on the future of services in a tariff world?
I think on the regional front, so some of the regional trade arrangements are pretty good, actually. One that we haven't mentioned is the RCEP, which actually has a negative list for trade policy wonks for services liberalisation, which means everything's liberalised unless you specifically exclude it. So all of the ASEAN LDCs have signed up to that, just to take one example. So there's actually quite a lot going on. I'm relatively optimistic about the negotiation side of this. We also saw an e-commerce digital JSI agreement in the WTO context. Relatively low ambition, but still, that's 80-something countries have signed up to that now. And that's the sort of thing you can only do, I think, in the context of the WTO. It's not a WTO agreement per se, it's a plurilateral. So I think there's quite a lot going on, actually, and reasons to be optimistic. Maybe one other thing on reciprocal tariffs that is interesting, and I'm not sure maybe we should, but we should give credit where it's due. So if you look at the Indonesia-US agreement, Indonesia has agreed to drop its objections to the e-commerce taxation moratorium, which has been a big issue for us in the ASR board, because Indonesia particularly, and India, to some extent South Africa, were the three holdouts. Now Indonesia has said, well, we're going to drop that. Will they do it? We'll see.
Well, likewise, they want to join CPTPP, where it's a ticket to entry as well. Look, that's been absolutely fantastic, but I'm sure that there are lots and lots of questions in the minds of the audience. So, Mia, would you like to lead us out? And if you could please introduce yourselves and then ask your question.
Thank you, Mia Mikic, University of Waikato and trade economist. You mentioned coercion and 16 pages agreements. Part of those, not agreements, but deals, relate to FDI commitments from all the partners. And so speaking in terms of funding the growth and development in developing countries, these are always reliant on foreign direct investment from the same partners that are now committing billions, hundreds of billions of investment to US. Any comments on where is that gonna go?
Well, Trump loves a good investment, right? So the pledges are crazy. And actually, if you just count up the number of Boeing airplanes that are pledged to be purchased, Boeing, before this even got started, Boeing didn't have a single available plane until 2029 because they'd already been purchased till 2029. And so some of those purchasing agreements are like, Cambodia's going to buy 10 Boeings. Well, great. By the time they get to Cambodia on the list of Boeings, it'll be, 2,100. And then Cambodia can simply say, well, now we're not doing it, right? And so what? So I think some of the investment purchases agreement pledges, whatever we're calling them, are less than they first appear. So that's good news, especially for development. Because again, if Cambodia is spending money on planes that it doesn't need, then it's not spending money on things it ought to be spending money on domestically. And if big trade partners are spending money on things that could be going to Cambodia to support Cambodian integration, then that's also a problem. So hopefully some of these pledges turn out to be more ephemeral than they first appear. And in other cases, some of them can be potentially drawn out or repackaged or repurposed. But the strategy is concerning. I mean, it's concerning on many levels, right? As a taxpayer, it's deeply concerning to watch your tax dollars go someplace else to invest in something that you didn't intend to invest in. Like, that's problematic. It's concerning because of the precedent that it sets and the argument that trade and investment, which of course are together, are somehow arm twisted together. Like, that could be a precedent that's a problem. So I think we're going to have to see where these investment pledges lead. And it brings to mind one aspect of these coercive trade deals that is not sufficiently appreciated, which is, at least not sufficiently appreciated in Washington. Your trade partner has domestic concerns of their own. And so your arm twisting is also creating domestic level challenges that could lead to potentially even toppling of governments because they are not happy domestically with the terms and conditions that they have been handed. That is a not zero risk, so we'll see how much more gets squeezed out of these investment commitments, but they create their own trail of destruction behind them as well.
Anything to add, Peter? Questions? We have one down there.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Hickford. I'm from MPI's Trade Policy and Economics team. I was just wondering, we briefly touched on it, given the dispute settlement body, the WTO, is currently incredibly paralysed with no end in sight to that. Where do you see dispute settlement, especially considering FTAs are being ripped up left, right and centre? Where do you see dispute settlement for trade heading into the future?
Yeah, the dispute settlement system is interesting. I haven't followed it particularly closely, but a few thoughts. There are still some panels that are being put together, and if the countries agree to abide by the result of the panel's findings, that'll be the end of it. But of course, if they don't agree, they can still the parties can appeal the finding into the void, as it's called, and effectively kill the case. And that's where the alternative arbitration arrangement, the MPIA, the multi-party interim arbitration agreement, enters into the mix. Australia is a member of that. There have been a few cases under the MPIA. It's not perfect, but it is a workaround. So disputes are still being settled. But in terms of reforming the dispute settlement system itself and the dispute settlement understanding, I'm not sure that there's consensus on that and what needs to be done. From the Australian side, we want to see, for instance, and here we largely agree, I think, with the American position, which is that there need to be procedural reforms, that disputes are taking too long to settle. Some of these cases that have come to the MPIA have been settled more quickly, so that's good. It shows it's possible to achieve procedural reforms, and so on. So I don't expect major overhaul of the dispute settlement system itself, but probably more of the workarounds going forward, and the MPIA particularly.
We may see more use of FTA dispute settlement systems, right? Which we haven't seen a lot of, and particularly not in Asia. We have lots of dispute settlement mechanisms in an FTA, never used. But if the global system continues to be disrupted, you might divert more of the attention and focus to these alternative ways to deal with disputes. And I would argue again, CPTPP people, why do we not have a secretariat? You cannot be managing these dispute settlement systems without a secretariat, right? It's weird to try to deal with disputes on the side of managing an agreement. Like, of course you need a secretariat to do this, especially if it becomes a bigger issue, because what you wouldn't want is to have the focus switch to these, especially these larger regional deals, and have insufficiently resolved dispute settlement procedures. Like, that's not good either. So thinking harder about how do we make sure, and this is a key message for government officials in the room, have we looked at, crucially, recently, what have we committed to in our dispute settlements, in our current FTAs? Are we actually prepared to, do we even know what the rules are? Are we prepared to manage a dispute, should we have one, in those existing FTAs? And if we are upgrading them, which happens all the time, what could we do to upgrade potentially the dispute part of this agreement if it becomes a default way to manage an argument that we can't do at the WTO anymore?
And of course, New Zealand has successfully taken the first CPTPP case, I'm sure not the last. Our ASEAN colleagues, we would love to hear from you if you've got any questions for our fantastic panellists, and or any of the university students in the room. You know, please don't be shy. We would really value hearing your perspective on these issues, or others. Felicity.
If there are any students or ASEAN people who want to ask a question, please don't let me hog the mic. But I did have a question about trust and confidence in trade, what we used to call social license, which is now becoming a sort of overused term. And what are the risks coming from all this disruption in terms of helping our publics understand and come with us on the benefits of free trade? We've sort of touched on this a little bit this morning because we talked about, you know, what does the ordinary person on the street think, and we touched on, a couple of topics associated, but I'm worried that too much disruption will actually cause a loss of confidence and then maybe a drive towards more protectionism.
So I have a couple of suggestions there. One is to remind people of the pandemic. And the pandemic should have shown most citizens that trade actually does matter, because when you shut off trade, people, investment flows, whatever, there are real consequences to that. And so reminding people, a world without trade looks closer to the pandemic world. Do you really want to do that again? That's one lesson that I think is top of mind for an awful lot of people who just lived through this horror. The second is, I think, and this is a longstanding piece of advice that I've given that governments don't seem to take me up on, but I'll give it again. Crucial, trade in the first hour of my day. So you need to be telling stories all the time about how trade affects you in the first hour of your day, from the time that your alarm clock goes off and you're laying in your sheets, which are not domestically made, to when you put your feet on the carpet, which is not domestically made, when you walk in and you use whatever beauty products you have, which are probably not domestically made. Then you go downstairs and you eat food, which may or may not be domestically made, on plates that are not domestically made, and you're listening to podcasts that could be foreign, like reminding people of all the ways in which trade matters to them personally. That is more urgent than ever. Because you need people to see that without all of that trade, their lives would be much smaller and much less sort of rich and full. And I think that's an important message to keep communicating, that, disruption is important. And then the third piece of advice that I give often, it's probably a little bit less relevant for government, but it could be, crucially, make sure that your family understands, or your employees understand, that you are part of trade. Especially, I make this argument often to businesses, because you get these people who work in foreign companies who will say, trade doesn't matter to me. And you say, hello again? Like, what is it you do all day long? Who do you do it for? And where do you deliver it? It's all trade. But people seem to think that trade equals owning stocks. And if you don't own stocks, you're not involved in trade. So just making sure that your employees, your staff, your government officials, and your family members, you can't deal with the whole world, but at least the universe that you deal with personally understands that that's what is actually traded in the lives around them. You know, point to the shirt they're wearing, where did that come from? That's trade. You know, the food you're eating, that's trade. You know, so just reminding people constantly of the importance of trade to their well-being, I think, is more vital than ever.
Yeah, I remember that blog you wrote at the Asian Trade Centre. Maybe you should.
It.
Oh,
That's what was so great about it. It was an intern of mine at the time who was a Kiwi.
oh,
So we were. It was Brexit, and we had a employee from the Nissan plant in Sunderland who said, "I don't own stocks. What is Brexit to me? I voted in favor of it." And guess what? They closed the plant. Guy is out of a job. So trade suddenly matters a lot to him. So we started doing trade in the first hour of my day, and my intern, who was New Zealand born, was like, yes, I'm totally into this, and we started writing a whole series of like why trade matters in your day. What are the things that you're doing, and how does trade interact?
well, maybe you should do a tariffs in the first hour of my day, because I think coffee would be right up there. Peter, anything to add on the social licence question?
No, but I think you're seeing it crop up in a whole range of areas. So if I think of the renewable energy rollout in Australia, for instance, this is a huge issue. So everybody believes in the importance of the green transition and uptake of renewable energies, but not in my backyard. So it's the old problem. And I certainly agree with Debbie. I think we need more Debbies, frankly, telling these stories. But it's much more difficult for governments to do. I think they really struggle to explain the story in sensible ways. One other thing I would add is cost of living, because that's a real issue for a whole range of countries. Interestingly, on that front, I think countries like Australia, maybe New Zealand as well, with all that surplus capacity coming our way from China, for instance, if I think of electric vehicles and the very high price for electric vehicles, those are going to get a whole lot cheaper, I think, over the coming weeks and months, as it has to be deflected elsewhere. So that's a potential upside for us. But these are not import competing industries that we have. And I think for those that have industrial capacity, the ASEANs particularly, that's going to be a key problem. Yeah.
More questions?
Just say on dumping, bring it on. Like if you're going to dump products in my market at less than the cost of production, unless I happen to be in a competing sector, what do I care? Fantastic. Give me cheaper whatever it is, you know? So I think we're in a world where we're going to see a lot more of that, some of whom will be in import competing or domestic competing industries where it will be challenging. But if it's not import competing and it's not domestically, what difference does it make? If they want to dump solar panels, awesome. Like, who doesn't want to have more solar panels at less than the cost of production? I always found this, I mean, I understand the politics behind why it's a challenge, et cetera, but the larger goal, don't you want to have more installed solar panels?
Actually, not seeing any other questions, so maybe I could sort of finish off with, oh, no, there is. Please go ahead. If we could maybe have our colleague from ASEAN. Yeah.
I'm Watanap from Cambodia. So we touch a lot on ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, but if we also look at small economy, very small economy, especially country like Cambodia, who will soon graduate from LDC. So in your perspective, what should small economy or LDC prepare or should do in the context that tariff become more normal, even in the next 4 or 5 years? The new president of the US, I personally think tariff will be there, not as good as before. So in that context, what do you think small economy, LDC should do? I would like to mention as well that for LDC or small economy, having a FTA with many countries, bilateral and multilateral, is not that easy compared to big economy. So in that context, in short term, medium term and long term run, what should they prepare? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's tough for Cambodia and other smaller economies facing reciprocal tariffs, particularly from the Trump administration. In fact, I have a PhD student who's just starting to investigate that issue, and we're at the early stages of it. So the options are not great. I think it goes to the future of that export-oriented industrialization model. And Cambodia is in the early stages of that now, but now you face these tariffs and restrictions on export into one of your main markets. You've also had problems with the European Union market for different reasons, and you face the problem of graduation, as you say. So you're losing the preferential access that you previously had. I'm not sure what your options are, to be honest, except doubling down on domestic reforms. I think that needs to be part of the conversation. So are you making yourself more competitive? Are there things you can do domestically to make that so? And I'm not sure. You'd be a better place to answer that question. But also negotiating more free trade agreements. That's clear. I know you've been negotiating some with the UAE, for instance. Others will follow, so more of that for sure. But it's a tough position to be in, and I would not like to be a Cambodian policymaker, I'll be honest.
I think that the domestic policy reform really matters. Dealing with the scam centers out of Cambodia in particular is a big one, because you are losing support within ASEAN, which is crucial. So I think that the good news about Cambodia and the rest of ASEAN is that you're already part of a bloc, and the bloc negotiates on your behalf, which I think has been great. But you will have to deal with some of the what would be otherwise called sort of, domestic level irritants within that bloc, so that they continue to have your back. So I would say that's one. Continuing to apply for other trade agreements, I think, is to be applauded and encouraged. So I noticed that Cambodia, for example, is even contemplating CPTPP entry. I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge, but that doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing. And so again, like the idea that you would be proactively saying, how can we better engage, I think is crucial. I think it really is crucial, because you have, graduation from LDC status is always tough, because you have all these preferences that suddenly vanish like overnight, and that's a bit of a challenge, on top of new tariffs coming in, extra difficulties. But I do see the government of Cambodia pushing hard for a lot of really sensible policy reforms and for engagement with other groups, which is very valuable. I mean, compare that, let me just say, to like a Bangladesh, also graduating from LDC status. Unlike Cambodia, though, Bangladesh is in a part of the world that doesn't have a particularly great functioning regional integration approach. And so what happens when they graduate? They are really on their own, whereas at least Cambodia is within ASEAN, within RCEP. We haven't really talked at all about RCEP, but within RCEP, has these other, ASEAN plus ones, which I think are really valuable for Cambodia, whereas Bangladesh doesn't have that. So that, to me, is a testament to the power of being in a region that at least tries to coordinate and is able to get better access for the group than you do all by yourself. So I think Cambodia, to be applauded, again, it's always a poster child for me of how an LDC can punch above their weight. Very helpful. Domestic reforms, always crucial. And then leveraging on those opportunities when they come along, I think is important. And finally, and again, and this is a bit of a sad note, but recognizing that, sometimes you really are picking the least worst option, which is not what you want. We always want win-win in Asia, and I would love to be the person who can give you win-win outcomes. This is not an environment in which win-win is likely. So you're really starting to have to pick the least worst, and that is never comfortable.
Do you have a very quick question in the last 30 seconds? We're short on time, I know, but Jen, is it okay if we have two last quick questions? Okay, quick answers, please, my esteemed panelists.
My question is relating to a role of central bank in the small open economy. Like as Dr. Devi spoke about that when there is a pressure in volatile tariff atmosphere, the exporters are going back to the government. So how the central bank is responding to such a scenario? As of now, we are experiencing the central banks are coming up with a measured or cautious approach of reducing their OCRs. Other than that, I think MPI policy is coming up, and but we have not seen much focus of central banks in supporting in such tariff pressure to the small exporters, particularly a small open economy.
One, Debbie?
Okay, the shortest answer, we could discuss this at length, but one of the benefits of ASEAN is that there's also a track for finance ministers. And in that finance ministers track of ASEAN, you have the opportunity at least to engage in dialogue and conversation and coordination to make sure that you are as much as possible aligned with your colleagues so that you're not all by yourself trying to deal with these serious economic pressures. And I think that is valuable, and compare that to places that don't have a finance minister's track, finance ministers and central bank governors. That's super useful, and you may need to make it even more important going forward. So you may need to figure out how can we meet more often, how can we have more projects or programs running within that track to support individuals who are trying to deal with a really complicated set of challenges.
Thanks, Debbie. And the lady, do you want to just shout out a very quick question? Okay, so Indigenous Special Economic Trade Zone, thoughts?
In the U.S.
In the US. Or is this across North America with Canada and Mexico, or?
Wow, that's a great question. I have not thought about that one. There is a discussion, in fact, there was a discussion around IEPA and whether or not that applied to all areas of the U.S. or whether there were carve-outs from that. And I don't know enough about how they've managed that so far. But again, interestingly, when everything is so disrupted, new options end up being on the table. So this could be a path for some creativity moving forward domestically within the U.S. or within Canada and elsewhere. I can't say more than that, but I think there's an option, at least.
Well, that's a lovely positive note to end on, uncharacteristically optimistic, if I may say so, Debbie. But thanks very much, and I'm sure that you can take that up with our fantastic panellists over the lunch break. So thank you very much for your kind indulgence in letting us go a bit over time, and to Jennifer as well. But most profound thanks to our wonderful panellists. This has been absolutely fantastic, and thanks for making the long trek, but also for these great insights. So please join me in thanking Debbie and Peter.